One feature of Catholic liturgy that sets it apart from most contemporary styles of praise is the long periods of uninterrupted silence. And this is unsettling to many people. I mean, let's face it, modern life is just plain noisy. We're bombarded with sounds of traffic, car horns and sirens, sounds of phones, alarm clocks, and all the machines that make our world possible. Now, if there's one thing that sets the modern world apart from previous times, it is the constant barrage of noise. So why so much silence in Mass, many ask? And why does a church that claims to care so much about music fill its liturgy with vast periods of silence? First, this question reminds me of the prophet Elijah, who, upon being told to stand on the mountain before the Lord, was engulfed by violent winds, fires, and earthquakes. But none of these, as powerful and as distracting as they must have been, brought the voice of God. However, in the silence that followed, when he heard a still small voice speaking to him in his heart, then he covered his face with his mantle, because then he knew he was in the presence of the Almighty. It was in the school of silence that Elijah learned to recognize the voice of God. And I'm also reminded of St. John, the author of the book of Revelation, who was caught up into the heavenly liturgy. And amidst angels chanting, he claims that there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. So why silence? And what is it about silence that's so important for the spiritual life? Well, silence is a powerful icon of God, perhaps one of the greatest icons we have. It is utterly simple, like one long now without division of parts. Yet it's large enough to contain all measure of diversity and plurality. When we allow ourselves to enter into silence, when we make room for it, we realize that it was there all along, not imposing itself like a tyrant, but waiting for us like a patient friend. It never left us. We left it, or rather, we forgot to notice it. Where did we go? We cannot create silence or manufacture it. We can only get out of its way and simply let it be. Unlike human artifacts, silence can never be rendered secular or timely. It can never be out of date or old-fashioned. Only human creations get old. But this is exactly what we should expect. Our creations were made by us and for us, to suit us and entertain us. And just as every cause is contained in its effect, so do our own artifacts resemble their makers, each in its own way, like various reflections in a mirror. When human creations no longer arrest our attention, we simply get bored with them, and we create new ones. A new pop song, a new movie star, a new fashion trend, or a new gadget to play with. But silence is different. Silence will forever lie just beyond the reach of human touch. Silence reminds us that there is something in our souls that will never be satisfied by a mere reflection of our finite selves. In fact, if we manage to sit in silence for long enough, that seemingly bottomless ache will begin to rumble in that even more bottomless resonance chamber of the human heart, and thus remind us that we will only be satisfied by the infinite God. Blaise Pascal once wrote that I have discovered that the unhappiness of men comes from just one thing: not knowing how to remain quietly in a room. This is why silence is so powerful for the spiritual life. It is the sound of the sacred. Truly, the rising of the heart and the mind to God, the very essence of prayer, is what the human soul will do naturally, if not troubled or distracted by noise. If not distracted, the soul, in a state of grace, will fall like gravity to God as to its true center. Perhaps this is the reason why so many of the great saints hungered for hours and hours of silence spent with God. It is here that the soul can truly be itself, and it is in silence that the soul can hear God. This is also why the music used in worship must be so carefully discerned. The music should not be aggressive or distracting, but rather it should focus the mind and calm the passions. Music in worship should be, in a sense, punctuated silence. One 13th century Persian poet once wrote, "Silence is the language of God, and all else is a poor translation." Now, I must confess, silence is hard for me too. I'm a sinner, and there's still much of that random noise echoing in my own soul from the original fault of our first parents. But I'm growing. Little by little, I'm growing. And I pray that if it is the Lord's will, one day I may fall asleep in sanctifying grace and pass over into that eternal silence of heaven. This silence is where all the prayers, psalms, and hymns will cease and reach their goal. They will reach their perfection in the silence of God. Then and there, in the silence and stillness of heaven, we will then hear that one eternal, ineffable word uttered from all eternity, and that will be the only sound that we hear. Brothers and sisters, keep studying. This is Father Brad Elliott for the Western Dominican Province.